Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 2024 NEMO Talks Series. My name is Suzanne Singer. I'm the Executive Director of the Sunshine Coast Conservation Association. I'm joining you today from Chekwelt, Gibsons, in Atcatsum Howe Sound in the territory of the Squamish Nation. The SCCA is thrilled to be partnering with Rhizome Up Media, Rogue Fest, and the Sunshine Coast Arts Council to bring you this year's Sunshine Coast Oceans Festival. This year's events are made possible with funding from the District of Seashelt, Sunshine Coast Regional District, Sunshine Coast Credit Union, the BC government, and the Canadian Ocean Literacy Coalition. We're so grateful to our funders and many other local donors for their support in helping us deliver these events for free to all members of the Sunshine Coast community. The Sunshine Coast Conservation Association is a charitable nonprofit society with a mission to protect and restore biodiversity on the Sunshine Coast. Our area of interest is over 2 million hectares from Howe Sound to Hamathko in the territories of the Shishach, Tliomin, Klahoose, Squamish, and Homolko First Nations. We acknowledge and recognize the rights and title of all nations in their territories. And we are deeply and sincerely grateful to the First Peoples who have stewarded the lands and waters of the Sunshine Coast and these territories since time immemorial. We take great inspiration from the connection, reverence, and respect Indigenous peoples have with the lands, the waters, the species, including us as humans. It is with this spirit of connection between all life on our planet that we bring the Sunshine Coast Ocean Festival. The Ocean Festival is inspired by the United Nations World Oceans Day. In 1992, the UN designated June 8th as World Oceans Day to raise awareness in the global public of the impact of human actions on our oceans, to develop and mobilize a worldwide movement of citizens for the ocean. Every year on June 8th, people all around the world come together to celebrate our oceans. And increasingly, as the issues facing our oceans and us grow, we want to grow awareness, advocacy, connections, and celebrations like this festival. Our 2024 program includes in-person and online screenings and thought-provoking, inspiring feature and short films and resources, interactive citizen science, education, and advocacy activities, and of course, our NEMO Talks series, all of which are intended to inspire, enlist, and connect people to take action to protect and restore our oceans. We are positively thrilled to be hosting Fiona Beaty today for our third talk in our 2024 NEMO series. Today, Fiona will talk with us about Coastlines, community, and climate activism and share lessons she has learned from the ocean. Fiona is also joining us today from Chekwelt in Gibsons at Atcatsum. Fiona is a settler marine ecologist, climate and conservation activist, and a wonderful community leader. She is passionate about protecting people and nature from climate change using approaches grounded in collaboration, science, and creativity. Fiona holds a doctorate in zoology from UBC, works as the science coordinator for the Indigenous-led MPA Network initiative in the Great Bear Sea, and advises a number of nonprofit marine conservations in Atcatsum, Howe Sound, and the Salish Sea. I've had the privilege of being able to work with Fiona over the last number of years, and you're truly an inspiration, Fiona. So today we're excited for you to take us on a whirlwind tour of some of the Sunshine Coast charismatic coastal species, from snails to eelgrass, and inspire our audience to connect with the sea as a form of climate and conservation activism. Fiona, I'm going to hand it over to you. And I'm just going to encourage folks, while Fiona's giving her talk, if you'd like to, if questions come to mind, or, just thoughts come up, which I'm sure they will, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we can circle back and follow up on those after Fiona's done.
Thanks so much, Suzanne and Sophie, and all the folks at the Sunshine Coast Conservation Association for hosting me today and putting on the whole Oceans Fest. It's really incredible and such a wonderful opportunity for us to connect with the sea and hear so many different voices speak and communicate in so many different ways about why this ocean is important to us and how we can be effective stewards for it. And thanks you all for tuning in today. It's such a sunny day. So I know that there's probably lots of different things that are pulling at your attention and energy, and it's really nice to just hold this space to come together and share some words. So I'm going to share my screen. You should be able to see the presentation now. Yeah, okay, great. So as Suzanne mentioned, I am really excited to share some words with you to hopefully spark your connection to our local coastlines as a form, and talk about how connecting to the ocean can be a form of climate activism. You might think of those two things as quite disparate topics, but hopefully we'll be able to bridge the gap over the next half an hour or so. As Suzanne mentioned, I'm joining from Chuqualp, Gibsons within the Squamish Nation's territory. And as a settler, over the last many years, I have really tried to practice reconciliation through understanding who I am in relation to this place, how my ancestry has led me to being here, and how I can work in service of not only the Squamish Nation's rights and title and stewardship objectives, but coastal First Nations within our province more broadly. And a lot of the content that I'm going to share with you has been directly informed from my work and from learning from the Squamish Nation. So a lot of the principles and the values that I hope can contribute towards this climate activism are very much have been taught to me from Indigenous communities in BC. So this picture I took on Bonnybrook Beach on November 12th in 2021. And this was the day that my grandmother passed away. When I heard the news, I was very sad and I needed to go to the beach because this is one of the places that I go to when I'm experiencing kind of emotional turmoil and I don't really know how to resolve those emotions. I can go to the ocean, and it just so happened that when I arrived, there was this beautiful sunset. My grandma, she spent a lot of time on the Sunshine Coast. This was a really important place to her. And I just felt this like huge wave of tranquility as I got to look out and feel like I was connecting with her spirit. And I'm sure that many of you can kind of relate to those emotions where you've had powerful experiences either in the water or on the water or near the water. It's an incredible driver of kind of therapeutic calming sensations. And so I kind of want to invite you at the beginning of this talk to think of a few moments that you've had in your life where you've experienced a powerful connection to the ocean. Especially if you are based on the Sunshine Coast, which I think most of us are, somewhere on the coast that is a special place to you, and just like hold that memory in that space close to your heart for the duration of this talk. Maybe right now you're thinking of a place where you've had a very powerful experience with one of the wonderful and like sometimes alien creatures that inhabit our ocean, whether it's an orca like the one demonstrated in this beautiful artwork, or a squishy tiny little invertebrate that is spineless and doesn't even look like it's of this world. Or maybe you're thinking of a moment like the one that I shared, where you're kind of impacted by the ocean in a more aesthetic way, the vision or the smell of the salty air, or the feel of the wind on your skin and hair. Or maybe you're thinking of a place that you've experienced countless hours with your family and your friends, connecting with each other, by the water, on the water, fishing, campfires, beach fires. It's one of my favorite things of living on the coast is I feel like the people here are very deeply connected with our sea. So I'm continuously in awe of all of the different ways that we can connect with the ocean, unique and collectively. I truly think that getting to live here is such a privilege, and it really enriches our lives. It's something to be very grateful for. But as you know, based on the topic of my talk, the ocean is very threatened, and it's nice to hear kind of the origin of World Oceans Day from Suzanne, that it's a time for us to draw attention to how humans are impacting the ocean and how we can, play a role in helping to mitigate some of our impacts. So climate change, we know, is not only affecting our oceans, but also our forests and our communities. This artwork depicts two species that are coastal species, cedar and salmon, also eagles, of course, and many other species. But our cedar trees here, we can see that they're struggling as winter precipitation regime changes. We get kind of less water, the winters are drying up, and also when the water comes, it comes in deluges, which makes it harder for the forest to absorb it. And that's leading to the trees becoming more stressed out as they experience these hotter and drier summers. And salmon are struggling as we experience drought, and their spawning rivers dry up. Their habitats are changing, the ocean is warming up. And these two communities kind of connect sometimes in the summer when we're experiencing these massive wildfires, which the intensity and the severity are and the frequency are being increased due to climate change's effects. And I had this interesting experience a couple years ago when we were, immersed in the gray, smoggy experience of wildfire smoke, and I was breathing in this air and just really like struggling with that concept that you can't really escape it when we're being exposed to wildfire smoke. It's the air that we're in. And I realized it's a really similar thing that many marine invertebrates are experiencing as their seawater is changing both in temperature and in chemistry. It's becoming more acidic due to climate change. So their environment that they're immersed in, that they cannot escape from, that they live within, is changing, and it's leading to becoming corrosive and so acidic that for certain creatures, it's dissolving their skeletons, which is a really, it's an intense experience. So I'm very scared about climate change and the way that it's directly affecting the life around us. So that's kind of like another emotional connection with the ocean. And a final kind of snippet, I'm not going to like sink too much into the climate change effects because I think that we all kind of know and recognize it. But the final like case study that I do have to bring forward is what we experienced around this time of year 3 years ago in June of 2021, when we had the heat dome blanket this part of the world, this part of our province, in very hot temperatures for 3 or 4 days. And this map is showing us a map of aerial temperatures, where you can see in these darker colors here, the seawater got to be, or the air got to be around 28 degrees Celsius above average, which is very hot. And this picture that we're looking at now, it's quite blurry and pixelated, but it's a thermal image of a mussel bed that was taken in West Vancouver. And you can see that some of the mussels reached 50.7 degrees Celsius. And that's very hot. Of course, that is too hot for these organisms to survive. And so we experienced a lot of death during that period of time, particularly for intertidal species, because since it happened just around the time of the summer solstice, that is the time of year when in the Salish Sea, the low tides occur in the middle of the day, and they're the lowest tides of the year. So the creatures that live in the intertidal zone, which is kind of a soft spot for me because it's so accessible and it's where a lot of cool invertebrates live, those creatures were exposed to the very hot air temperatures for a lot longer than they would have otherwise been. And that resulted in mass mortality. These are some of the headlines from that time period, and they're very heavy. Like billions of creatures died, cooked to death, boiled alive. Hundreds of humans died due to the extreme heat. So it's very real. It like hits you. And as a marine biologist who was studying these creatures at the time, it was a very sad period. Every time that climate change has these direct impacts in our communities, it's very hard to kind of cope with emotionally. So we know that climate change is affecting our communities, and this is an effect that is being experienced in different ways throughout the world. The climate crisis is driving changes, and we're having to rapidly adapt to them and try to mitigate emissions to the best that we can. But how do we connect back to that like ocean-centered, community-based activism if it's a global problem? I'll go into that shortly, but before I do, I also want to kind of draw out the lens even further to underscore that the climate crisis is intertwined with a few other crises that we're experiencing in society: biodiversity crisis with the loss of biodiversity, and the social justice crisis. And these three components are kind of underscored, in my opinion, by a common denominator, which is the human tendency sometimes to be extractive. So throughout the world and throughout time, humans have this trait. Not every human everywhere and not every human all the time, but a lot of our systems are being extractive toward the earth and the ocean and toward each other. And so over the past few years, as I think about climate activism, yes, I still emphasize that emissions reductions are extremely important, and we have to advocate for our politicians to kind of step up and advance those actions now. But more broadly, in our systems, throughout different avenues of life, in how we treat ourselves, each other, our communities, and how we harvest food and how we educate, etc. If we can center reciprocity and regeneration and relationality in place of extraction, I think we'll really be able to shift our systems and our ways of being towards ones that kind of move us away from these three intertwined crises. So that's the overall thesis of my talk. And I think if you can walk away from this talk with an ability to kind of identify any way that you are contributing toward an extractive system and recognize that, and then think of how you can in place center reciprocity and respect and regeneration, that will really bring us forward into hopefully a new way of being. So I want to kind of focus in on one of those R words. Coincidentally, they all start with the letter R, and it's relationality. So this approach, or this understanding that like building relationships with each other and with the places that we live and with the many life forms and non-living systems that we're deeply dependent upon and intertwined with, growing that relationship can lead to more respect and understanding for the life around us, and then love and care, which can hopefully lead to a better way of being. And so I'm going to talk through kind of 3 marine species that I've been able to grow relationships with over the last few years, and learn from, and hopefully they can kind of catalyze and activate you to care about them and try to protect them throughout your lives. So the first is a snail. I said in my talk thesis that they would be charismatic, and in my opinion, these are very charismatic creatures. Although they're not whales, they are in fact snails. They're quite small, and they live along our shorelines on the beaches. Their range actually extends from Central California up to Alaska. And you can find them at kind of like medium to low tides. They're further down in the beach. So they're past the fucus, they're past the barnacles, they're past the mussels, they're further down. Almost where you start to get kind of like the seaweeds in the low tide life. Their name is Nucella lamellosa, which is the Latin name. Their common name is frilled dogwhelk, which is kind of a funny name. And it's because their shells are so frilly and ornamented. And these guys are a charismatic intertidal voracious predator. Many snails are grazers. They munch on seaweed. These guys actually drill into mussels and barnacles, and then they secrete an enzyme that paralyzes and digests the tissue, and then they suck out that liquefied animal. So it's kind of wild. It's sort of like zombie-like predation, but because they're a snail, it takes them several days to eat a single mussel. So they're still slow creatures. They can live 10 to 15 years, so that's quite old. You know, I think sometimes we look at mussels and snails and barnacles and we think they're kind of like, maybe they live for 1 or 2 years, but they can actually live for 15 years, which is quite a long time. So those are some fun facts that hopefully maybe you didn't know about this creature, and you can go out to our beaches and try to find them. I care about them because they were kind of a cornerstone of my graduate degree at UBC. I didn't really have that much marine ecology experience before starting at my program at UBC, and this picture on the left here, it was taken from one of my first forays into the intertidal at 2 a.m. In a night in November at Stanley Park at the site of the girl in the wetsuit. It was pretty funny, like literally like went to bed, woke up, and went out into the beach to collect snails. It's like a little Easter egg hunt at midnight. And the reason why we went out at the time is because that's the time of day or night that the tides are low enough to access these creatures, whereas at this time of year, particularly over the next few days, actually, because it's the new moon, we have really low tides in the middle of the day. So you can go out and find these snails. And the reason why I was studying them during grad school is because, unlike many other marine invertebrates, these guys reproduce by laying egg capsules, and the baby snails crawl out of the egg capsules. And they're snails, so they really don't disperse that far along the shoreline. And that means that this species has relatively restricted gene flow, meaning they don't really, unlike barnacles or mussels, which release their sperm and their eggs into the water column, and then it's carried sometimes like tens of kilometers along the shoreline, which leads to a lot of genetic mixing. These snails are their populations are quite discrete. And that means that over time, they might evolve to have genetic differences along a spatial gradient, and they might adapt to their local environmental conditions. So part of my research at UBC was looking at to what extent populations of Nucella lamellosa have evolved different tolerances to seawater temperature, and then how that evolution might impact their response to ongoing warming. And so I studied populations in our home waters in the Salish Sea, and I also studied another population on the central coast of British Columbia. And I chose these two regions because even though they're along our coastline, they actually differ quite significantly in terms of the seawater temperature that life here experiences. In the summer, the Strait of Georgia is consistently around 4 degrees warmer than on the central coast. And we also experience, as I talked about earlier, heat waves and kind of midday low tides in the summer that mean that the life in the intertidal gets a lot more heat stress here. So I wanted to see if these populations showed any different tolerance to seawater temperature. And I found that they did. This slide is showing snails from the central coast on the top, which are darker and more frilly. And then the snails in the Strait of Georgia are white and smooth. And this difference in shell color and morphology, so the size and shape, already kind of indicates to me that the snails have evolved, even though they're the same species, they've evolved different traits to cope with different temperature. So if you're white, you're more likely to reflect that heat from the sun, and if you're dark, you might attract it a little bit more. So I'm not going to show you the results of my work, but what I did find is that the snails in the Strait of Georgia are more vulnerable to ocean warming for 2 reasons. The first is that the water here is warming up at twice the global average rate of ocean warming compared to the central coast, where it's warming at half the global average rate. So that's really important when we think of to what extent can we adapt to climate change. The rate of environmental change really matters, especially as it aligns with the rate that we can genetically adapt. And then the second reason is that the seawater temperatures that these snails are experiencing in the Strait of Georgia are already kind of at the upper limit of the temperatures that they can experience. And I found that based on my lab experiments. So we're already kind of approaching this is too hot for me. So any future warming might really surpass those populations past their thermal limits. So that's kind of a dire headline, and it's concerning, but to me, it's really just kind of recatalyzes my interest in engaging in climate activism, and reminds me that these species that live on our beaches that are super cool and like curious snails, they might not be here forever. The beaches might look different over the next 100 years. And so that engages me to further kind of encourage people to get out to our beaches and care about these snails and learn about the myriad life forms here, because they might not always be here. And the beaches that we experience now are different from the ones 100 years ago for various reasons. So that timeline piece is really important for us to think about as we connect to the places that we care about so dearly. So overall, with these snails and this sort of species profile, they're slow. So that's a reminder to slow down our life. They're vulnerable. So we need to make sure that we care about them and share their story. Like, so much of human communications is very anthropocentric, like human-centric. Or if we talk about marine life, it's like whales, and yes, they're super cool, but like also the snails. These are smart predators, and they're voracious and curious, and they're super accessible. They're just on our beaches. You don't even have to swim to interact with them. So that is my snail snapshot. And now we're going to move on to an incredible plant that is also super dreamy, and lives along the Sunshine Coast shoreline. In fact, the Sunshine Coast in the Howe Sound region has some of the most abundant eelgrass. That is, sorry, spoiler. So eelgrass is the species that we're talking about now. It's this beautiful underwater seagrass that grows in quieter, more sheltered bays with softer sediment. So a lot of Howe Sound is a fjord with rocky, steep cliffs that just drop down essentially vertical, especially up near Squamish, and that is not conducive to allowing this plant to grow. But along the West Howe Sound shoreline, from kind of Williamson's Landing down to Gibsons Harbor, we have a lot of really wonderful eelgrass that grows in these beautiful underwater meadows This picture is a little bit grainy, but you can see that these plants create underwater meadows that are sort of like underwater forests, and they provide so much habitat for little plants that grow on the blades, and then invertebrates that eat the plants, and the fish eat the invertebrates, and then the birds eat the fish. So in eelgrass meadows in the Pacific Northwest, there's over like 390 species that have been counted in a meter squared of eelgrass, which is just remarkable. So I think that they're very important for forming habitat for biodiverse underwater ecosystems that we love. And another reason why this plant is really cool is because it's actually, its ancestor is more related to terrestrial grasses than to most of the other marine plants that you'll find. So it's not a seaweed, it's a seagrass. It has roots, and those roots are really central to why it's an important species. It can stabilize the sediment, and it can also trap or sequester carbon because it's photosynthesizing, it's taking carbon into its tissues, and then it can transport that into the roots and store it for long periods of time in the sediment, which means that in certain parts of the world, this is an important source of blue carbon, which is another contribution towards climate carbon sequestration, carbon storage. And I also just love that it's like a grassroots metaphor, because the way that I interacted with this plant over the last few years has been leading and organizing community restoration activities. So about 6 or 7 years ago, I started working with a nonprofit based on Vancouver Island called Sea Change Marine Conservation Society. And Sea Change was interested in helping to restore the health of nearshore ecosystems in the Salish Sea by working with communities to identify places where they wanted to restore the health of seagrass meadows. And I love this because my role was to kind of connect with community groups and invite people to come out onto the beaches and help prepare these eelgrass shoots. We harvested them from healthy beds, and then we brought them to places where we wanted to restore. And we spent a couple hours on the beach with community volunteers tying washers to the eelgrass shoots, and then divers would go out and plant the plants. And I can't tell you, like, this project, it went on for 3 or 4 years, and we conducted transplant in 9 different bays in the Sound, including Gibsons Harbor. And there's been so many gifts that have come back to me through that experience, mostly through the people who I met who came out to help out and volunteer at those events. That led to collaborations down the road. For example, this picture, this woman her name is Di. She's an artist based on Bowen, and her artwork is what I've showcased in a lot of the slides here. That's a really cool collaboration. And it was just really like inspiring, especially during COVID, to host these events where people would come together and build community and remind each other of the importance of connecting with the ocean and connecting with each other. So I thought that that was a really wonderful experience and something that I'm super grateful to this plant for providing to me and helping to shape my form of activism. Another thing that you might have seen if you have walked along the waterfront in Gibsons is these marker buoys that are out in the water that indicate a voluntary no anchor zone to protect the eelgrass. There's 5 or 6 of them out there from Armour's Beach to the Gibsons Harbor, and they're helping to encourage boaters to, or they're essentially asking boaters not to anchor in depths where the eelgrass grows, because dropping your anchors is one of the ways that people degrade eelgrass beds, because I'm sure if you're a boater, you might have unintentionally done this before, where you pull up your anchor and there's a whole bunch of seagrass connected to it. And that's always a sad thing. Lots of people don't want to do that. And so by putting these markers out there, we can indicate to boaters like, hey, there's this plant that grows here, please don't anchor in this area. And I think that this is another reason why I loved this project and initiative, is because it's voluntary. It's not like mandatory. There's no enforcement or anything like that. It really relies on people to proactively take care of nature and to request them to comply. And I think that that's a very inspiring mode of change making to me, is just through sharing a message and through getting people on board voluntarily rather than in a coercive way, which also works in many contexts. But through the voluntary mechanisms, we can hopefully get people to like understand at a deeper level why this is an important thing to do. So this plant has taught me a lot, and I hope that you can connect with it to kind of further understand why plants that form habitat are super important for marine biodiversity and also for human community connections. Okay, so the third species that I'm going to pitch to us before drawing our presentation to a close is herring. We have to have at least one fish in this compilation. So herring are a tiny forage fish. They form the base of many marine food webs and are very important to marine ecosystems in the Salish Sea, particularly to salmon, which then feed the orca, which are super important for a whole bunch of different cultural and economic reasons. Herring eat plankton, so they kind of connect the marine plant to the marine animal food webs. And over the last few years, herring play a really central role in the story about the recovery of ocean health in Howe Sound. So this picture on our left is artwork from Di. She was that artist who I mentioned, participated in the eelgrass transplant on Bowen Island. And then on our right, we have two pictures from a survey, a herring survey, spawn survey, that's happened in the north end of Howe Sound over the last 4 years, led by a group called the Howe Sound Marine Stewardship Initiative in partnership with the Squamish-Ohomeo, the Squamish Nation. So just to kind of take us back in time a little bit, herring have, pre-contact, were an incredibly important species for the Squamish Nation. And one of the ways that the nation connected with this species, which would come into their territory and spawn from kind of February to April each year, is they would host ceremonies where they would dip hemlock and cedar boughs into the water, and the herring lay their eggs on those boughs, and then the nation would harvest some of those boughs and eat the herring spawn, which they called chemesh. And it's really tasty. The Squamish Nation has all sorts of ceremony and celebration about the return of this fish to their territory, because it's kind of, in many coastal First Nation communities, the return of herring and ulican to their territory signifies the start of the new year. You're coming out of winter, and this is one of the first species to show up and provide fresh food to the communities. So it's a really important species for coastal food security and coastal community culture. Sadly, though, along BC's coast, commercial fishing has decimated herring populations, and the Salish Sea has the only remaining commercial fishery for herring along BC's coast. The populations in Haida Gwaii and the North Coast and the Central Coast and offshore of West Vancouver Island have really dropped, so they can no longer support commercial fisheries. And in Howe Sound, we had herring spawn here, but due to a whole bunch of different impacts, whether it was the coastal or the commercial fishery, or the industry that operated in Howe Sound, such as wood fiber pulp and paper mill, the chemical plant up in Squamish, Howe Sound pulp and paper mill, Britannia copper mine, in the 20th century, Howe Sound was known as a dead zone because so much of this industry heavily contaminated our seawater and led to the decimation of a lot of marine life. But thankfully, over the past kind of 2 or 3 decades, there's been a shift in industrial practices, and also several of the industries have closed down. And that's allowed the marine life to come back. The water quality is improving, and we're seeing the return of forage fish to our territories, which is really, really incredible, because on the backs of the forage fish can come the marine mammals, the pinnipeds, the sea lions, the seals, the whales, the porpoises, all of those bigger things that people notice. But really, like, it's these little fish and it's plankton that are kind of the undercurrent of a lot of that ecological recovery. And it's incredible. And it led to, over the last 4 years, or about 5 years ago, the Squamish Nation was able to have their first cultural harvest of chemesh in several generations. So that's really exciting. And for the last few years, I've been able to participate in and support some of the survey efforts to gather information about where herring are spawning as the species is kind of recovering in the region, up in the Squamish estuary and along kind of the fjord in Squamish around where wood fiber LNG's site is, so that information can hopefully inform some of the work associated with that development project. And throughout the rest of the community, I think we're only starting to learn, and there's like several species whose story this can kind of encapsulate. A lot of the stuff that happens in the ocean is out of sight for humans and out of mind. And we're starting to kind of uncover the different extent of herring spawn activity in the region, just like in a similar way, we're only now scratching the surface of the incredible marine life, like the glass sponge reefs that exist in the Sound. So it's a reminder that I think we have to be careful and move slowly as we develop and as we conduct our activities in the area, because this recovery is very precarious, and we're only starting to see this return of life for certain species. And I think we really need to do our best to make sure that we're not developing or approving industrial projects too quickly, so that we can allow these life forms that are so important for marine ecosystems and for community health to recover. So that's what I learned from the herring. It's that we are a part of this ecosystem, and that we need to really ensure that we're centering those cultures and those practices that connect with the ocean, and be mindful of extractive development practices that can endanger the health of ocean ecosystems. So with that, I'm kind of going to draw this talk to a close. I hope that some of the things that this talk might have left you with is a sense of how the ocean can really heal yourself. It can offer therapeutic benefits in moments when you're feeling emotional turmoil, by just allowing yourself to go to the ocean and connect with it. It can also lead you to building a sense of community through participating in stewardship activities, or through just going down to the beach and talking to other people who are down there and exploring the intertidal and becoming fascinated with those little creatures that you might find there. And then it's also a reminder that, yes, okay, we don't breathe seawater, but we are part of the marine ecosystem as well. We eat the food, we impact the life there. And so we have a responsibility to act in ways that are mindful of and respectful towards all of the life forms in that area. So some of the R words that I mentioned at the beginning: respect, reciprocity, relationships, regeneration. I hope you can take those away from this talk and really try to center them in your behavior and in your work and in your professional or personal lives. And in doing so, to me, that is a form of climate activism, and that can hope to transform our systems toward better ways of being. And that's my talk. So I want to thank, there's so many people who have taught me over the last decade and my whole life, really. Too many to mention here, but some of this content came from my experience in school at UBC, so thank you to those individuals. Some of it came from working with nonprofits in the Howe Sound region, so thank you to those. The Sea Change Marine Conservation Society and the Howe Sound Marine Stewardship Initiative are two of many that operate here, among with the Sunshine Coast Conservation Association. So thank you to them all, and thank you to you all, because part of this is also just from being a part of the Sunshine Coast community and getting to live in a place where there are so many people who care about the ocean here, and it's very inspiring, and I'm grateful to that. So I would welcome any questions that you might have, or stories that you might have, places that are important to you along the coast. I think that's always a really wonderful thing to learn about. And yeah, that's all I have. Also, thank you to Di, who provided a lot of the artwork in this presentation.
Fiona, that was amazing. It's really a beautiful thing to watch your work progress and expand and turn into this, this really beautiful message of connection and reciprocity. It's really cool. I think one of the things that we sometimes miss in the scientific community is that weaving back the personal connection and recognizing, we are one strand as humans, or one strand in the whole big web of the ecosystem. So it's really wonderful. I'm curiosity. I really feel that with your, with what you're bringing forward is like those sparks of curiosity. I think that really bring people into the conversation. So I love that. I'm gonna say, just sort of logistically, maybe what we'll do is we'll ask folks if you want to put up your hand to, ask a question or just jump in the conversation and let us know how you felt about Fiona's talk. It'd be great to have more of a conversation this time. And Fiona, do you want to handle that? Do you want to call?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I'll call in Carol Ann.
Hi, Fiona, that was a great talk, very inspiring. This is a curiosity question because I saw by the wind sailors recently in several places along the coast, but I've never seen them here in the Salish Sea, and I wondered if you knew whether they are in this area.
I don't, by the wind sailors, you said?
Yeah, they're like a jellyfish with a little sail that pops up.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a Latin name, but I don't know.
I think the Latin name is Velella.
Yeah.
It's like the little blue ones that drift
Yes.
along.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I think that those are really cool species. I've seen them on the central coast of BC. I don't know that much about them, to be honest. I haven't seen them within the Salish Sea, and I don't even know what their role is in the marine food web. But I think that they're very cool. And yeah, so you saw them here?
No, in Tofino and then in California.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't seen them in the Salish Sea, but
okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, Suzanne.
I have to unmute myself now. I'm curious about with the heat dome. You talked about sort of at the very beginning, you asked us to ground ourselves in experiences with the ocean. And I have many, many, many beautiful experiences with the ocean, especially raising a kid on the beach and all the joy and the excitement and the fun. But one of my most sort of visceral experiences with the ocean was during the heat dome. Swimming in, going down to the sea to cool off and swimming in muck. And that was so creepy and weird. And, just recognize, and it took me a minute to understand what was actually happening, that, it was basically swimming in melted mollusks. So that, changed me, I feel, forever, and sort of amped up my desire to want to help protect the ocean and curb climate change if it wasn't already really strong. But I'm curious about the aftermath. Like, are we seeing a comeback? Or, how much of an impact did that one event make on the shore and the creatures?
Oh, yeah. Such a good question. And I can relate to that exact experience where like I went to go swim to like relieve myself of how hot it was. And then I was like, oh my God, like I can't swim in the water right now. Yeah. It's very spooky. So heat domes are increasing in intensity and severity as a result of climate change. Heat waves, sorry. And the heat dome was like probably the most intense heat wave experience that any of us have had and that we've had in the Pacific Northwest in general. And it happened to coincide with that really low tide event, which is why there was such significant mortality along our beaches. Thankfully, over the last few years, we haven't had like sequential heat domes. I think if we had had another really significant heat wave at that same time of year in 2022 or 2023, it would have more significant effects. Because what that heat dome did is it killed a lot of the marine invertebrates and especially killed the bigger ones and the older ones. So now if you go to the beaches, you'll see that many of the marine inverts are smaller, but there is recovery. Like some of those beaches where all of the mussels died, now there's hundreds of baby mussels on them that are growing, which is really cool. The ocean is a resilient place. There is so many larval invertebrates that are spread out each year. So many of them died during that event, and that freed up real estate for smaller ones to come back. And they're doing that, which is great. But if we experience multiple heat domes this year, and that pattern continues where we have heat waves that are just kind of escalating and compounding and maybe happening back to back, that's when it gets really scary and really bad for the marine invertebrates, because it means that they won't necessarily have that same couple of years to reestablish their populations. So it's not all bad news. The ocean is a resilient thing, which is wonderful, but we have to be watchful and make sure that, we're doing what we can to mitigate climate change so that those heat waves don't stack up in dangerous ways.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We had earlier, if I don't see a hand up, I'm going to start pulling some of the questions. Oh, there's Billy.
Not getting my question. Hi, Fiona. Thank you so much for your inspiring talk. It was just great to be hearing about some of the things that are going on. I was really shocked when you said that the Salish Sea has twice the rate of, ocean temperature rise. Wow, that's really amazing. Is that because I'm guessing that's because because of the depth, that it's shallower than other parts of the ocean? Is that right, or is there another reason for that?
There's a couple of reasons. So I wish I had a map of the Salish Sea, but for those who don't know, the Salish Sea is, it includes the Strait of Georgia, Puget Sound, and the Juan de Fuca Strait. And it's kind of this like inland enclosed ocean or sea that's separate from the open Pacific Ocean. So one of the reasons why it's warming up faster than the Central Coast is because of that separation from the big ocean mass of cooler water. We have a lot of internal oceanographic circulation patterns that retains seawater in the Salish Sea and means that it can heat up more quickly because it's separate from that big cold body of water. Whereas on the Central Coast, there's a lot more flushing. So that's one reason. Another reason is because of the influence of the Fraser River. The Fraser River contributes so much fresh water into this body of water, and fresh water is less dense than seawater. So in the summer, it means that we have this like quite strong stratification where fresh water sits on top. That's why, if you go swimming here in the summer and then you go swimming on the West Coast, it's like starkly saltier way over there. Like I grew up swimming here, and I'm still, most of the times when I go and swim in like coastal waters outside of the Salish Sea, I'm shocked at how salty it is. It's really fresh here, and that water sits on top, which means that it heats up faster because it's not actually mixing with the full body of water, which again would lead to like slower rates of warming. So it means that in the summer, the seawater heats up quite a bit faster here, which of course impacts the intertidal organisms that are affected by that fresh water, or exposed to that fresh water and not the deeper water. And then some people postulate that it's because of the human activities in the area. Like we know that there's urban heat island effects in urbanized areas with all of the land mass that's kind of like cement and attracting a lot of that heat. So it could be that there's sort of like a spillover effect of that human activity into the water. I'm not as confident about that, but yeah, where there's humans, there's and more development, there's going to be more heat and like affected ecological processes that would otherwise cool the water.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. That's really great. I think Paul and Maureen, they had their hand raised, but I don't want to call on you. I see Saramit popped a message into the chat, which is kind of along the same theme, so maybe I'll go to that. And they asked, can I comment on the unique acidity conditions in the area? So yeah, the Salish Sea, another very unique component of the marine water here, or the Strait of Georgia in particular, is that in the wintertime, the acidity becomes very low or high, low pH, high acidity. It's like easy to get this jumbled in my brain. And there's thresholds that marine organisms that form shells, we call them calcifiers. And what they do is they take calcium carbonate out of the water and they build shells out of them. And they rely on the seawater to be a certain chemistry in order for that process to be favorable. When the seawater becomes too acidic, their shells start to dissolve. And it's a lot harder for them. It takes more energy for them to build their shells, and their shells kind of dissolve more easily. And that is what's contributing to the negative effects in ecosystems of ocean acidification. And so in the winter in the Salish Sea, in the Strait of Georgia, our seawater naturally is more acidic, and that's potentially in part due to the strong freshwater inputs that we have in the area, because freshwater tends to be a lower pH than the ocean. And so that naturally low acidification or low acidity in the seawater here, then when you stack ocean acidification on top of that, which is a global phenomenon, it leads to the threshold for calcification to be like the seawater here is below that threshold for longer periods of time. So yeah, we're both a hotspot for ocean warming and a hotspot for ocean acidification. The only like good thing I can contribute there is that they happen at different times of year. So at least the organisms aren't simultaneously exposed to that really low acidity water and the hot temperature. The low acidity happens in the winter, and then the hot temperatures happen in the summer. So there's like, it's like back-to-back stresses, but at least it's not compounded. We know that when the two stressors are happening at the same time, that can be really dire for marine life. But it's all challenging for sure.
I've got another one, if it's okay. I always have a lot of questions, so I'm happy to like infill while other people are waiting to put their hand up. I'm curious about the eelgrass, and I think there was a comment in the chat too about this, about, you know, how are the eelgrass transplants faring? Yeah, and I'm curious about, are the voluntary no anchor zones effective? Are they working? And are the transplants taking? Because I know it's not that easy. It's hard to transplant eelgrass. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I love it because it kind of brings to light the uniqueness of how these transplants were done. So Sea Change has been doing eelgrass transplants in the Salish Sea for like 25 years. So they have a methodology that works, but for the first like 20 years that they did them, the divers, the Sea Change team, which is a pretty small team, would go to the places, do the transplants, and then come back and monitor them. But they really didn't have that much engagement with communities. And so that meant that they were missing a lot of the local knowledge that is important to informing where we should be doing restoration and informing the team about what human activities occur in the area. And that's essential because you'll see why. So in the Salish Sea ecosystem restoration project that I was participating in, Sea Change decided to shift their methodology, where we asked community members to help us identify appropriate restoration sites. And we worked very much with the First Nations in whose territories we were working to help us identify places where they would like us to transplant or not. And that inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, I think, really contributed to bumping up the success rate for restoration. Restoration is a really resource-intensive process. I should say, like, conservation always should happen, and then restoration is a secondary thing. Like, we want to protect the spaces first rather than destroying them and trying to like return them to health. So like definitely conservation first and then restoration. But if we're doing restoration, it's really resource intensive. It's not always successful. And so the more different knowledge sources that we can bring into informing the process can increase its success rate. In Howe Sound, we did we restored eelgrass in 9 bays, and we monitored them 2 to 3 times a year for 4 years after the restoration occurred. And we had success in 8 of the 9 bays, which is really high and really unusual. And I think in part that's due to the like tailored selection process that we had. And they were also relatively small transplants. Like I'm sure you know, like Boundary Bay is one of the few examples in the Salish Sea region where there's like a huge eelgrass meadow, and it's very important habitat. Whereas in Howe Sound at Catsun, we kind of have pocket coves and fringing bed, which also provides really valuable habitat, but it's in a different way than those bigger bays. So yeah, we had pretty successful restoration. I think it's largely due to the community input. In terms of the no anchor zones, we haven't necessarily monitored those as well, I'd say, but anecdotally, I think that they're leading to really great awareness. There's 2 in Catsun Howe Sound, one on Bowen Island and one in Gibsons. And the Bowen Island one was installed in partnership with the Bowen Island municipality, and they've really taken on a lot of the like ownership of kind of monitoring them. whereas the Gibsons one, the Nicholas Sontag Marine Education Center is doing that on behalf of the town as a part of the Healthy Harbors project. So that's a really, or the Tide Pools Aquarium now. New brands. Yeah.
Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah. We got a couple more in the chat.
Okay, so how is kelp doing? I'd say, first of all, there's a few other voices on the coast who are much more kelpy than me. Leanne Ennis is one of them. So if you want to learn about kelp farming or kelp distribution on the coast, I would definitely connect with her. My knowledge is that kelp used to grow in Howe Sound, like bull kelp and these bigger kelp species. And 20 or 30 years ago, it kind of dropped off. And that's a similar story as a lot of the Salish Sea. Kelp is very vulnerable to ocean warming. Many of the larger kelp species like to live in places where the water is cooler and there's a lot of flushing, so that it gets lots of oxygen and nutrients and all of those other things. So we haven't seen a recovery of those big kelp species in the Sound, I think likely due to climate drivers. And kelp, there's lots of areas in the Salish Sea and along the whole west coast where kelp is dropping off. But there's certain areas where there's still like effective refugia for kelp. But we have a lot of like smaller kelp species that I think are doing relatively well, like sea colander or sugar kelp. So it's not all bad. And yeah, I think that like there's a lot of really cool kelp restoration programs that are kind of bubbling up to help with restoring the kelp ecosystems. Kelp is also vulnerable to predators that will eat the base of the kelp, such as urchins. So that's a really interesting ecological story where with sea star wasting disease, it knocked out a lot of the sea stars which predated on the urchins. And so now the urchin populations have really ballooned. And those are now like knocking out lots of kelp areas and leading to these like underwater urchin barrens where there's just like hundreds of sea urchins and like nothing else in sight. They're kind of spooky spaces. So yeah, species connectivity there.
I'm
Okay.
just gonna flag before you get to the next one. There's 2 more questions in the chat and it's 1 p.m. and Fiona's, we said we were gonna have a hard stop of 1:15 and we need a few minutes near the end so we can wind up.
Yeah, maybe I'll take the 2 more questions in the chat there. Or actually, I see 3 of them. So Aaron's comment, could limiting the runoff in winter cause higher acidity by planting more vegetation to slow runoff along with rain gardens be potential solutions? Yeah, so I definitely think, I'm not sure about the connectivity with seawater acidity, but definitely that there's a lot of discussions around kind of those like green shorelines and nature-based, I don't even know what the right wording is, but along roads, improving the planting so that we can, this is really sad, but I'm sure many of you have heard the story of the like rubber preservative that there's a chemical in it that leads to really high mortality in coho populations. I think it is like 90% of them will die if they interact with this chemical that is in our tires and then gets rained and runs off into streams. So there's certain things that we have in our systems that are very negative for marine life, and if we can restore kind of plant systems, especially adjacent to freshwater and to marine systems, that can help reduce the flow of those contaminants into our aquatic systems. The second question there from Rob Knight, which eelgrass species were planted and have we seen any problems with Zostra japonica being present? Great question. So there's 2 main eelgrass species that we have here. The first is our native species, Zostra marina. That's the one that we were restoring. It lives kind of low intertidal, but more in the subtidal. And then there's a non-native species called Zostra japonica. And in most instances, from my knowledge in the Salish Sea, that non-native species actually lives kind of in the low to mid intertidal. So it occupies a slightly different ecological niche than Zostra marina, where they overlap a little bit, but they have their own separate spaces. And so they're not competing as much for habitat, which is good. It means that non-native species isn't necessarily negatively impacting our native species, and it provides similar habitat. I think that there's maybe some disease interactions, but I'm not as positive. We only restored the Zostera marina. And then Sarama's question around a possible sighting of a sea otter in the area. Any news about this, since it's related to health of kelp? I also heard that. I think it's awesome, but also, I don't know. There's definitely not been like recurring or more than one observation of the sea otters. For those who are unaware, most of the sea otter distribution, sea otters were kind of like locally extirpated along BC's coast due to overhunting. And then they've been recovering through time and reintroduced. I think the first remnant populations were in Alaska, and then slowly they're recovering along the west coast of Vancouver Island. And yeah, they are important for also controlling urchin populations and other invertebrates to ensure that there's like a healthy balance of kelp forests. I don't have much knowledge beyond that for their presence in the Salish Sea. They would definitely lead to significant ecological outcomes, and there's lots of really cool stories and question marks around them. But yeah, not too much knowledge from me on that. I think I'm kind of losing my voice, so if it's okay, I'm going to turn it back to you, Suzanne, and just say thank you again to everyone for your great questions and your contributions here.
Fiona, you've done amazingly well at answering this really large array of questions, and each time just linking it back to all of the things that each of the creatures and each of the species, you know, are this interrelated ecosystem and not just one thing on their own. It's been a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for being here. And I learned a ton. Every time I talk to you, I learned a ton. And that's the point, right? A major aspect of the NEMO Talk series is really to do just what you did, to connect people with projects and with each other, and to help inspire and advance conservation, and also take away actions. So some of the SCCA for this program, we've got a page on our website that is actions that you can do to support the ocean. So Fiona, if there's any of the links, I think we got some resources from you. We'll pop them up on our action page, and we'll encourage everybody to go and check them out. I think Sophie's populating the chat with Fiona's contact information and all those websites right now. So if people are very inspired and want to get involved, please follow the links and find a way to plug in. To everybody that came out to hear this talk, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for engaging. Thank you for being interested. It's really inspiring to hear from all of the amazing groups, and also just see, all the people in our community coming together to learn more and to get involved.